Okay, I guess we can resume. If we get everybody here. If everybody's got his lunch, his supper, his coffee, his tea, his milk. As I was coming up here, I was listening to the Catholic station, and somebody was being asked about teaching of epistemology in Catholic schools, and the respondent said yes, that epistemology is being taught, probably as an elective, though. What he failed to note is that even though it might be taught as an elective, it would not necessarily come to the same conclusion that once would have been evident in Catholic colleges. You may have a professor who doesn't have any clear conviction. An epistemology course often amounts to nothing but a course in the history of various epistemological positions with no conclusive inferences drawn. Or you may have somebody teaching it who is simply an idealist. As a matter of fact, when I had, philosophy of nature at the University of Detroit, more years ago than I'm willing to admit, it was taught by somebody who was an out-and-out Kantian. And curiously, I managed to get in touch with him within the last year or so, and I didn't realize at the time because I was just a sophomore student, but he said that he had been invited to teach there, and he didn't realize that there would be certain difficulties with him being a Kantian, and so he didn't stay very long. But of course that was a long time ago, and today I'm sure he'd be welcomed with open arms. So the fact that a course is given is no guarantee as to its content or its conclusions. All right, we had gotten down to point 12 here. Do you have any questions on any of the prior divine attributes that we have been talking about? Or are you all omniscient?
These attributes, 12.
Right.
These are Aquinas' attributes as he explains them?
The numeration is more or less happenstance. Largely, I'm following the order that is presented in the Summa Theologiae, but there's no deliberate intention or deliberate effort made to do that.
Okay, so this is the standard language of discussing the attributes.
I hope it is.
Yeah, okay. I didn't know if,
It should be.
Okay. Thank you.
If it isn't, it's what ought to be.
I didn't know if you had, if other people had added things over the years, and this was.
There's always people adding things, but
okay, but
this is
from
basically
Aquinas.
St. Thomas, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, number 12, of course, we've already dealt with some of these, but I'm just kind of grouping together some things that are pretty evident at this point. Intellect, obviously God is intellective because we possess intellect, bearing in mind, though, that because of the divine simplicity, he is pure intellect. This is not, reminds me of what Aristotle says when he says that God is a thought thinking itself, which is a pretty apt description given the divine simplicity. God is perfect self-reflection. Remember that in knowing creatures, he does so by reflecting upon the content of himself, his own knowledge. And he knows creatures simply by knowing himself as the cause of all creatures, even to the very last iota of their being. So too with will. If we have free will, certainly God is no less than that. Everybody at one time was getting all excited about the notion that God is love. Well, of course, one should rightly be enthused by that based upon its scriptural foundations, but I'm thinking back in the 60s when they were getting carried away with the notion. And indeed, God is love, because God is, by virtue of the divine simplicity, every perfection, every action, everything that we would find in us as a distinct faculty in him is all perfectly identical. So yes, God is love, perfect love. But you could also say, I suppose he's perfect hate, in the sense that that perfect love is absolutely opposed to evil in any form. We think of hate, of course, in very negative terms, but hatred of sin is not a vice. And God certainly hates any perversion of his creation, because he wills that the creation be perfect and that it therefore express the maximum of goodness. With respect to volition or will, in what sense can God be free? Especially when we consider that God is from all eternity himself. He is what he is, and he has to be what he is in a certain real sense. He cannot be other than he is. So one might argue that from all eternity, he has to be and to make whatever choice or choices he has made. Again, we have trouble with time here. We tend to want to thrust God into time. And there is a certain truth in saying that he can't change his choice. But of course, you notice we can't change our choices either once we have made them. In us, there is a distinction between the before and the after. It is most difficult for us to conceive what it is that God should be eternal, but at the same time be an eternally free choice. I say be a choice because he doesn't make choices. He is his own act of choice because of the divine simplicity. He is a substantial act of free will, a substantial eternal choice, but also a substantial eternal act of understanding, which is identical to that act of choice. We find this difficult to conceive. Should we be surprised? Look at the subject matter with which we are dealing. God, by the way, some of these notes, you'll notice that what I did in the last week was to take some of the side notes that I had introduced during the class, and I put them into the text itself. So if you have not printed them out yet, it probably would help you to do so, because it will fill in your prior notes, not just what we're doing going forward. God wills his own good necessarily. He has to. He hasn't got a choice but to love himself infinitely, because he is the only infinite good and therefore infinitely lovable being. We always say to somebody, you have too much self-love. You love yourself too much. And indeed, this is something that's a little bit hard for people to understand, because we're talking really about an inordinate kind of love. If one loves himself perfectly and properly, one would also understand ultimately that God is a more perfect object of love than we are. So that in a very real sense, in the philosophy of love, we learn in a way that we are born into this world completely self-absorbed, nothing like a little baby, thinking only of itself and perhaps not even thinking for some period of time. But everything is me, me, me when we come into existence. And the whole project of our existence is slowly to come out of ourselves to begin to learn to love another as well as ourselves, to begin to learn to love others for their own sake, to begin to learn to love God, and ultimately to learn to love even ourselves for the sake of God. And only when we do that have we learned to perfectly love ourselves, because we are not in ourselves the complete be-all and end-all of creation. We ultimately make sense only in reference to our Creator as our first cause, and to God as our Creator, but as the last end, because we have been created for Him and to reach Him. and to manifest goodness in ourselves as best as we can, goodness which ultimately comes from him. So in the case of God, were he to love any creature as an end in itself, it would really be foreign to his nature as the supreme being. In God's case, infinite self-love is the only proper act. And you can understand that when you realize that ultimately perfect love of ourselves as creatures is only had when we love ourselves as a means to loving God. Obviously, that's really hard to grasp, really hard to imagine. This is something that one would understand if one was already a saint in heaven. That really to love oneself perfectly does not mean that the act of love terminates in the self, because if it does, there is a higher good to which it ought to be subordinated, and that would be God himself. So God wills his own good necessarily, but then as to creatures, this is where a certain kind of freedom of choice arises, because God didn't have to make us. God didn't have to make us. I remember a friend of mine, Dr. Joseph Dieska at the University of Dayton many years ago, said to me that he had come home from class after telling his students that God made us because he loves us. That's why he made us. And then he came home and realized he taught them complete heresy. God doesn't act for creatures as an end in themselves, because that would be a lesser good than himself. Everything God does ultimately is with himself as the last end. So that his, as difficult as it is to imagine, his choice to create us is an act of manifesting his glory. It is a free act on his part. He doesn't need to do it. We don't add anything to him. We have to remember, the creature doesn't add anything to God. Qualitatively speaking, every perfection that can possibly exist already exists in God. We don't add anything by way of perfection to God. We add by way of multiplication and division. We add by there being more instances of the realization of a perfection. But the perfection is always found in an unlimited way in God already. So God choosing to create us didn't have to do that. He could have just sat there sublimely from all eternity, being himself. He would be no less. He would have been no more. He would not be any more selfish by having done so. His act of choice in creating, therefore, is completely free. Doesn't have to do that. Now you might say, but he has created us. He has created this world. So isn't he, therefore, because of divine simplicity, eternally frozen in this choice? He made this world, as opposed to any other, whatever this world entails, I don't know, doesn't matter, but whatever it is he chose to make, here it is. He is identical with his choice, therefore he is eternally necessitated by this choice, which means he never could have done anything else, therefore he isn't free. Would that not follow? You can tar and feather me on the way out. Here again, we have to be very cautious not to insert God into time. God is timeless. He is indeed an eternal act of choice. We know what he has chosen by way of Monday morning quarterbacking. We know what he's chosen because we're here. We know what he's chosen because we see the choice. But it is still metaphysically correct to say that he didn't have to make this choice. When I say didn't have to, be careful. The word have to tosses it like into the past, like he was sitting there for some period of time before he made this choice to create this world, and having created it, now he's stuck with it. Yes, he's stuck with it, but in the same sense that any free being is stuck with the choice that he makes. But God didn't have to make this choice. It could have been a different choice. He could have eternally been a different act of choice. So we have to be careful not to make that mistake of saying, well, because we now know what he chose, therefore he did not have a free choice in making it. The only reason we know what he chose is because we are here observing it. Now you can't say, well, there was a time when he hadn't made the choice yet, because there wasn't such a time. God is an eternal act of free choice with respect to creatures, not with respect to himself, because he necessarily wills himself. He is perfectly voluntary because he's a free being. So his love for himself is a voluntary act, but it is a necessary act. But with respect to creatures, it is a free act. He, in other words, it's hard to express this because it's hard to say it without putting him into time. He is eternally his own choice. And his own choice includes this world that he freely chose to make. But that doesn't mean that he could not have existed with some other choice as being the option that he would have elected. But given the fact that he has elected this world, or whatever it is he has created, then that becomes the eternal free choice which he has made. And I don't like the word has, which he is. Any questions on that? It's extremely hard even to describe, as you can see, because our language is filled with past, present, and future tenses. We can't help ourselves. And it's very difficult to abstract from time and realize that God is just plain outside of time. So that when we say he is absolutely free, it isn't as with us, where we are free before we make a decision, because we are not bound as to which way to go, and then after we make the decision, we're stuck with the choice we made. In God, there isn't a before and after. He simply is this eternal free choice. Don't put him into time, or you're going to mess it up. That's why it says God's will is eternal and irrevocable. What he has written, he has written. He eternally wills whatever he chooses. And of course, just as our choices are irrevocable, I mean, if I have killed somebody, I've done it. I can't undo it. God cannot undo it. That would be a violation of the principle of non-contradiction. So his choices are also irrevocable. Don't ask him to go back and undo your past misdeeds. Can't do that. You can try to fix up your future because we're creatures in time. We can do something about the future. We can do something about the present. Can't do much about the past. Because God is totally outside of time, you get into very interesting questions like, can you pray for things that have happened in the past? Could you pray, for example, for the salvation of Aristotle? Why not? God is totally outside of time. And therefore, he knows in the present, your prayers, or from the going backwards in time to Aristotle's time, he would anticipate your prayers in the future for Aristotle in Aristotle's present. But remember, future and present, those are our words, not God's. So we can properly ask God, which is what prayer is, for anything at any point in time, past, present, or future. this, I'm trying to recall very quickly, I'm rather rusty on the facts, but I think this was the point whereby St. Thomas Aquinas had a difficulty with the Immaculate Conception, because he could not see how it would be possible that Mary could be free of original sin when Christ had not died and risen from the dead to redeem man. And of course, it was not St. Thomas, but somebody else who pointed out that God is totally outside of time. Therefore, his redemptive act reaches back into the past.
I think Suarez might have solved that.
Yeah, I was trying to remember who it was.
It was John Duns Scotus.
Oh, SCOTUS, I'm sorry.
Scotus, John Scotus.
Okay, that sounds
He was one of the
closer.
S's.
Yeah, Suarez a little bit later.
Yeah, SCOTUS, I think.
But even St. Thomas didn't see it. Perhaps this was just God permitting him to be humble. That's why we have to constantly remember that God's outside of time. That's why it's one of these key concepts. Eternity is a key concept. Simplicity and eternity. Simplicity because we keep tending to forget it. We keep trying to make God complex when he isn't. We have to remember that every act, every faculty, every aspect, the divine essence itself, they're all one and the same eternal act. An eternal now, we say. Even the word now puts us in time. It's like the word simultaneous means at the same time. So when we say God's whole life is simultaneous, we're using a word that doesn't quite properly apply. Probably the easiest way is just to remember time is part of creation. God is simply outside of time. God's will is fulfilled. And one might ask, well, what about when creatures don't do what God wants them to do? Well, as it says here, divine justice is met because either the good are rewarded for being good, or else evil are punished. In either case, divine justice is met. The punishment may be through natural or supernatural sanctions. You have to distinguish in God between what we call the antecedent and the consequent will. Antecedently, for example, God wills that all men be saved. Consequently, that is to say, after the fact that people have acted out their lives, those who have not done so well may not end up so well. Now, does that mean that God failed in his will? His will is an antecedent will in the sense that he would, I don't want to use the word wish because it sounds so wishy-washy, it sounds so human, but he would will, he would intend that all be saved. But divine justice requires that their salvation, their success, rest upon their free acts. And if their free acts do not conform to the divine order of reality and that which is truly good as opposed to evil, then certain natural or supernatural sanctions will follow. And that still is within the province of the divine will. And of course, remember, God from all eternity knows what we're going to do. So although he wills that we attain him as our last end, he may also know in some cases that we're not going to get there. And that's why I believe it says here, the consequent will alone actually exists, because God, of course, from all eternity, knows and wills that things be as they will actually be. Again, I say will, that's will future tense from our standpoint, not from God's standpoint. Okay, anything on will?
In one sense, when we pray and we ask God to do something, how does that?
I mean, we're going to change his mind.
Yeah, and are we changing his mind, or is he? How does it work?
Oh, I'm going to stand here and tell you how God works. He doesn't work, he rests.
Thy will be done, not mine.
He knows from all eternity what we're going to do. What you're really doing, I think, when you're praying is you are fulfilling the needs of the divine justice. That there is a certain equity that has to be bound. And what you're doing by praying is you are putting something on this side of the scale that allows the divine justice to remit some kind of mercy over on this side of the scale. God, of course, knows beforehand whether you're going to say the prayer. And he wills, again, from all eternity, that things be in accordance with all of this system of balances which are required. It would not be, and God is, in a sense, bound by his own nature and perfection and goodness and justice, that there be this kind of a balance within creation. And he invites us to participate in the ordering of creation by our free acts. He respects our freedom. He respects secondary causality. He doesn't make us just a bunch of puppets that have to do what we have to do. He permits us to participate in the working out of his creation. And therefore, he knows from all eternity, of course, how we're going to do that. And we freely participate by doing it. He knows in the year 2010 that somebody is saying a prayer for Aristotle that allows Aristotle at the last moment of his life, several hundred years BC, to turn in a proper way towards God so that his soul may be saved. Now you could say, well, it wouldn't have been if it weren't for that prayer. True, it wouldn't, perhaps it wouldn't, indeed. But God from all eternity knows that that prayer is going to be said. Again, going to be in the future tense. Very hard to talk here without putting our foot into our mouth.
So could you pray for someone who already died for their conversion?
That's exactly what I think I'm saying. Yes, I do not see why you cannot pray that the order of events in the past be more beneficial to somebody, even though by all appearance it looks like they really screwed up. So in a sense, it's an extremely optimistic way of looking at things. God is outside of time, so you can pray that the past be reordered in a more beneficial way. Yes, I don't see why not. And I mean, after all, you can say, well, what is done is done. Yes, it is, but we don't know what it is. And God knows that in our ignorance of what has actually happened, we are praying, and those prayers can affect what actually has happened. But again, remember that when we say, well, you can't undo what's done. No, that's true. But we don't know what was done. And we act by, in praying, we are actually affecting what was done. Now, it may not, not every prayer is going to be answered, is it? I realize how counterintuitive it seems to say that an act in the future can affect something in the past. But remember, when you are praying, you are asking God, who is outside of time, to intervene in some way in the order of his creation. And would he be limited and unable to act simply because we are at this point in the temporal or chronological scale, and the event that we're referring to is at an earlier point in that chronological scale, when he is completely outside of time?
So is this intervention in a material way or in a spiritual way?
Well, it can be any way that God wants to intervene. He can intervene in both ways, can't he? God can affect the order of creation any way he wishes that is not self-contradictory.
It's not self-contradictory. You have to add that. Because it almost sounds as if you're saying that we can pray that the past be changed.
Yeah, well, you're not really changing. The point is,
But you're saying, for one thing, it's more of a debt that was taken into account at the very beginning.
yes, so that you're not changing the past, but you don't know what the past is. and you're praying in light of the fact that you do not know. But the very act of praying may affect what actually has already occurred.
But have we known that someone died in mortal sin? Would we still pray?
We don't know that. We don't know that. God knows that. We don't know that. I think on rare occasion He may let us in on it, but
So we could pray that someone in some way repented. We don't know what they prayed in their heart. You know, that in their last moment.
right,
We pray that they.
we can pray that they did what they should have done at the last moment, yes. So even somebody who seems to have passed away in not the best of circumstances, there still is reason to pray for them.
Even if they committed suicide?
Well, especially if they committed suicide, because you know they may well have not been in their rational faculties. You're judging the acts in terms of the material content of the act, what the person has done, but the morality. Here we're slipping into ethics. The morality of the act is really ultimately in the formal order, in the subjective order of responsibility, the modifiers of responsibility that would affect the degree of responsibility that they had in committing the act. So even though an act may be just terrible, we don't know the state of their mind at the time that they committed it. God knows, but we don't.
See, I thought we do.
He said,
But he revealed to us
I thought,
many instances where somebody will be condemned or
well, if God wants to tell us, fine, but we have no way of telling from the outside as human beings. We do not know what somebody had in his mind when he was doing something that might have been really horrendous in itself. Granted, you know, you can make a practical judgment. I'm just saying that at the theoretical level, you cannot be certain that your practical judgment is correct. And you could pray that it wasn't. It makes me think of something that Dr. Waters has repeatedly said to me, that Father Woodbury said to him at the time that Joseph Stalin died. He came up to Dr. Waters and said, "Pray for poor old Joe, because nobody else will." Sort of a double-edged sword there. You may have your suspicions about what may have happened to Stalin, but ultimately, it isn't our job to be condemning people, but to rather be hoping in their salvation, right? We're just a little revengeful at times, that's all. And that's not a virtue.
so I can pray for Hitler then.
You can pray for Hitler. I might find my preferences elsewhere, but if you want to pray for him. And remember, you know, no prayer is for naught. God will reach some good out of it, because again, he's balancing the divine justice. And your prayer will do some good. It may just not go right where you expect it to go.
But was revealed to us, are we wasting our prayers? You know, for example, it's not up to us what's happened. If we see these people or whatever, or they see us in heaven, and it's great. But isn't there wasting the prayer for somebody which was revealed to us that there will be no chance for them? For example, not baptized people.
Well, when is it revealed to us?
Yes.
I mean, again, we have to be very careful not to be presumptive in our judgment.
No, we're not judging, but we just leave it to God. God will judge, but I'm not going
Yes.
to waste my...
Well,
But no
it's
prayers
not a
go to
waste.
waste.
Yeah, they don't go to waste. Either they will affect the good that you specifically have in mind, or God will use them for some other good.
But the doctors of the church, they teach us that don't waste the prayer for non-Catholics even. If somebody was outside the Catholic Church,
I don't.
You can't have a public mass for somebody who's died outside the church. But we always pray for conversion or,
we pray for conversion, but not for the dead ones already.
oh, really, you know?
No,
Well, I don't want to slip into theology here.
no, but because this way we can,
Don't pray for it.
Because we're making our judgment that nothing can be judged, that then we can ask for everything.
We have to make practical judgments in life.
That's right.
But I'm speaking here theoretically, and indeed, if one wants to make a prayer for somebody, even though the situation does not look good, it is not, I would suggest, totally irrational to make such a prayer. But prayer, like anything else, you got a choice as to who you want to pray for, and nobody's going to tell you who you got to pray for. I mean, at least in terms of detailed specifics.
And sometimes God says no.
Yeah, exactly. It's up to God. Let's see here. Next paragraph, God is infinite love of his own goodness. I guess I already did this a little bit. He loves all other things through self-love. In other words, he loves all creatures. In loving himself, he has to also love the acts by which he creates, and therefore the objects which he creates, which are creatures. So this idea of God creating simply because he loves us, well, actually, I don't want to get into theology, but I think that's inaccurate. He creates to manifest his glory. But that doesn't mean he doesn't love us. He loves us infinitely and perfectly, but he loves it through us, through loving himself and loving us as the objects of his act of creation. Now, when we say he loves infinitely, that doesn't mean that every one of us is infinitely lovable. That's a different matter. It's the old thing about the empty glass and the size of the glass, which you've heard a million times. Our capacity to receive quid recepitur ad modum recipientis. Whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver. And as I say, there are many other divine attributes. Do you have any that you're interested in that I missed? Or of which I am totally ignorant? If you do, I hope you don't come up with it. That brings us to the next point here. It's a different page on my notes. I don't know where they came out on yours. But are they printing out better?
Yes.
Point number 4, which is the problem of divine foreknowledge and human freedom. We have already somewhat dealt with this, but this is a problem that has vexed human thought for a long time. It has been used by atheists as arguments against the existence of God. And it runs basically in this fashion. If God has infallible and perfect knowledge of all future events, and he does, then how can man freely choose his future acts? Because God knows from all eternity what we're going to do. To him, it's as if it has already happened. And if his knowledge is infallible, it cannot be otherwise than the way that he knows it. If it cannot be otherwise, how can we say that we do it freely? Now, this involves several conceptions. Concept of foreknowledge, predestination, predetermination, and freedom. Foreknowledge means that from all eternity God knows what we are going to do before we do it. Although remember, watch out for that little word before. Predestination means that from all eternity, God knows what's going to become of us. If you put it in theological terms, he knows who is among the elect and he knows who is among the damned, even before he creates us. Indeed, in reading St. Thomas, I came across the section on predestination, and I thought to myself, good grief, he's a Calvinist. He believes in predestination. But then there's another term one has to bring into bear here, and that is predetermination. Predetermination means that there's nothing you can do about it. God knows from all eternity what's going to happen to you. It's got to be the way that he knows it. It cannot be otherwise. Therefore, whatever's going to happen to you is already written. It's done. It's over with. You're through, for better or for worse. And then, of course, the notion of freedom. How do you juggle all these concepts at the same time? Well, let's look at a couple points here. First of all, as I already indicated, God's foreknowledge is not before knowledge. The fore part of it is from our standpoint. Since God is entirely outside of time, and therefore knows all things in his present. Predestination. Now here you've got two alternatives. Calvin really kind of follows his metaphysics to the bitter end. Basically, he's saying God knows our future and there's not a thing we can do about it. We are predetermined. And that's why you should be living the good life, because that's a sign that you're probably among those who are to be saved. And if you're living a miserable life, that's a sure sign you're among the damned. And there's nothing to do about it. Too bad, sorry. That would be to identify predestination and predetermination. Aquinas holds a different position. God knows from all eternity what is to become of us, but he does not thereby predetermine what is to become of us. Now that's the nub of the problem. How is that possible? How does God respect human freedom? We have to go back and look at the sense in which God determines every creature. God determines every creature in the act of creating it. And in creating it, he creates the nature of the thing which he is making. And he even creates the acts which every creature posits. Because after all, God creates everything. When we say God creates, we don't mean he just, as the deists would say, creates the world and just sets it on its way and has nothing further to do with it. Nor does he create us, even as spiritual, intellective, rational animals, and then we're kind of set on our own way, and he doesn't really sustain those actions by which we freely choose. No, God sustains everything. He sustains the very act of choice. He has to. If he didn't, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't exist. This is the difficulty. We must remember, though, that when he determines a creature to be, he determines it to be according to its nature. And that means he determines natural things to act according to their nature. By natural things, I mean those things less than man. I'm talking about the birds and the squirrels and the atoms and so forth. They must act according to their nature. We must act according to our nature too, but the difference is we are free beings. So that for us to act according to our nature is to act freely. God creates us to be and to act as we are, but that means to be and to act in a free way, because that's the way of our being. The creature's free act, it occurs in time. Remember, God is not in time. The creature's free act before it is committed is undetermined. We don't even know what we're going to do. By the time you've chosen what you're going to do, you've already determined your act. So the faculty is actually, it's the faculty that is free. When it exercises its act, the object of the act, by the time you choose to rob the bank, you've already made your choice. That's not free. That's the product of the free choice. It is the choice itself that is free. God knows the act before it is committed as undetermined, and after it's committed, he knows it as determined. But he does both from outside of time. In other words, he knows the distinction between the undetermined act before it is placed and the determined choice after it is made. But he also knows in that process the act of free choice as it is exercised by a free agent, whether angelic or human, at the time that it is being exercised. It doesn't, the fact that he knows ahead of time, or rather outside of time, does not change the nature of the act itself. If it is a free act, he knows it from all eternity as a free act. He knows, therefore, the last end, the destination of every creature, but he knows it as having been attained in non-free agents by non-free acts, and in free agents by free acts. So it really does not change anything. It's just we have to, again, remind ourselves that God is utterly outside of time. Now, there is a deeper question here that I'm not really dealing with, because it would extend beyond the question merely of foreknowledge, but that is, how can an act be free? That's a different issue. I can't go into everything at the same time. But suffice it to say that if free acts are possible, God knows them as what they are, and he knows them as free. And the fact that he knows from outside of time that this act is occurring in this way does not determine it, except that it be according to its nature as a free act. See, there's a little equivocation in that term, determine. God determines all things, but he determines that they be according to their nature. Non-free things as non-free, free things as free. It doesn't mean that they're determined in the sense that they must be non-free. It means they are determined in the sense that they must be according to their nature. Okay, any questions about that before? Joe?
Yes, then perhaps you should use the word ought in this, when you're referring, when you say that man must, rational man must act according to his nature. You mean to say that he ought to act?
No, he must act according to his nature. As a free being, he ought to act in the ethical sense in accord with his nature, human nature adequately considered. He ought to act in accordance with all of the powers that God has created for him. But he cannot help but act as a human being in the sense of making free choices. Again, there's an equivocation in the way we're using the word nature here. In one sense, the nature means the way that God constitutes us as a perfect being. In another sense, we're talking about part of our nature is that we are a free being, and being free, we can act against our nature. Man is naturally free to act against his nature. We have this wonderful ability. And God knows us both in terms of how we ought to be according to our nature and how we can act contradictory to that oughtness. The ought you refer to belongs to ethics. What I'm referring to here belongs to philosophical psychology. Okay, anything else on this problem of foreknowledge? Which brings us to, finally, the problem of evil. And before that, we briefly have to consider what is meant by the good. But as you know, those of you who are here, I already dealt with that. I put this into the notes just to give you the framework for what we already had considered. Let me just run through it very quickly to get it on record, if you will. The notion of the transcendentals are those things that are equivalent to being. Being considered in itself and positively is just called being. Considered in itself but negatively is called the one. Things are called one or have unity by reason of not being divided. A thing is not divided because it has one active existence, as it were synthesizing the totality of its being. Things are called good because of a relationship to a knower. True. Things are called true because of a relationship to a knower. So that when the mind conforms to being, then it is said to possess the truth. So the true is being from the standpoint of a knower. The good is being from the standpoint of an appetite. And of course, we have to distinguish in appetites between the sensible appetite, which we share with animals, because animals seek after the sensible good, food, sex, whatever it be. Man not only has a sensible appetite, but also an intellective appetite. Intellective appetite's the name for the will. So thereby we seek for intellective goods, such as virtue. Squirrels do not run around trying to be virtuous. It's just not part of their squirrely nature. The good, then, is being as desirable, which is a definition that goes back to Aristotle. The good is that which all things desire. And on the next page, I believe, I've got that little argument, which I gave you verbally in a prior class, but here it's laid out for you. It's from the Summa Theologiae of St. Thomas, Book 1, Question 5, Article 1, the body of the article, where he lays out this thing that looks like a syllogism, but it isn't really. It says, a being is desirable insofar as it is perfect. And of course, that's because when you look at any being, if there's some aspect of perfection to it, then we say, well, that's good. And of course, a being is good insofar as it's desirable. So a being is good insofar as it is perfect, but it's perfect insofar as there's some existential completeness to it. So we say a being is perfect insofar as it's in act, and it's in act insofar as it is being, because you're touching back to the very act of existence. So we argue at a very theoretical level that a being is good insofar as it is being. Now, you might say, well, exactly how does that work? Bear in mind that the good is measured by nature. God is the supreme good. What he makes is good, he isn't good because he makes good things, but things are good because he is infinitely good and he makes them. They are good because he makes them. And he makes them according to their nature. So the measure of their goodness is the degree to which they fulfill that nature, the degree to which they perfect. What do you say perfect? That means to make completely. Faccio, to make thoroughly. Per. See? So a thing that is perfect is something that fulfills its nature. It's like that example I gave you before about the horrible still life painting that's got one good tomato on it. Insofar as that tomato looks like a tomato, all the rest looks like it's died. That one thing looks somewhat like a tomato. To that extent, it's perfect because it fulfills. It is good. It is desirable because it fulfills the nature of tomato-ness, and God makes tomatoes, just like he's the only one that makes trees. So that the notion of the good must be measured by, we must understand it in terms of nature. And the implication of this is, number one, and here we're into new material, nothing is evil by its very nature or substance. There's no such thing as a thing that just by its very nature is evil. Nothing. Nothing. You might be tempted to say, well, what about something like Lucifer? How could such a heinous, horrible being be good? But you have to remember, in Christian theology, Lucifer is the light bearer, the highest of God's spiritual creatures, of all creatures. The corruption of the best is the worst. But Satan understood, Lucifer understood as in his nature, is a very perfect kind of being. Highly perfect, the most perfect of all creatures. Intellective, appetitive, of course, ultimately corrupted by the object of the appetite that's been chosen. But considered as a being, absolutely superb. But for all the more reason, abominable, because of the perversion of that great goodness. So evil must be understood in terms of a perversion or a defect, a turning away from the perfection of a given nature. So nothing, there's nothing you can name, no thing that in itself is by its nature evil. Some say, well, what about an atomic bomb? They're great for digging ditches. Big ditches. And then certainly they manifest all kinds of physical perfection of power and so forth. You can think of some artifact which you might say, well, this by its very nature is terrible. No, it's not terrible by its nature. It may be terrible or evil by the way we use it. And we may have designed it for that use. I mean, you could use a guillotine for slicing onions. Don't have to use it for chopping off heads. It's a question of what you use it for. There's nothing that by its very nature is evil. But things can be evil because they don't live up to their natural nature, like the blind horse. It's not evil because it's a horse, but it's evil because it's lacking the perfection of sight that a horse ought to have. And an act may be defined as intrinsically evil, but that's because it's not a thing. An act is an act, and the act is defined by its relationship to something that is defective. Thus, the act of homicide, willful, negligent, or unjustified homicide, is evil because it deprives somebody else of their right to life. But no matter how bad something may seem to be, there's really always some element of perfection about it. I mean, you think about somebody like Machine Gun Kelly. What was good about him? You would walk into the bank in the 1920s and shoot everybody with a machine gun. What do you have to say on his behalf? He was a good shot. I mean, it's all a matter of the way that you look at the object. If you consider it from the moral standpoint of what he ought to have been shooting at, that's different. So, in other words, anything that you look at, you can see aspects of perfection, aspects of desirability, aspects of goodness about it.
Just like the example you gave of the bad cold.
Yeah. Bad cold is really a very good cold. We walk into somebody and say, how do you feel today? And the person says, I feel horrible. I've got a bad cold. And the truth is, no, you don't have a bad cold. You've got a good cold. It's the best cold you ever had. If it gets any better, you go to the hospital and die. Because the cold is wonderful. It's thriving. It's you that's not so good. Evil is a predicamental accident. means it's in the order of quantity, quality, relation, action, passion, time, place, and so forth, as opposed to a predicable accident. It is the lack of a due perfection, not the lack of perfection per se. Every creature lacks perfection because it's only a creature. It's a lack of a perfection that ought to be in something, but isn't there, as in blindness in the case of a horse. A horse ought to see. Nothing wrong with a blind stone. You know, how would you feel if I went around taking up a collection for the prevention and cure of blindness among stones? Are you hard-hearted? You won't give me anything? See? Don't you feel sorry for those poor stones? It's got to be focused on something that ought to be there but isn't there. Something that belongs to a thing's nature but is absent. Okay, any questions in this area? I'm hesitant to get into the problem of evil itself tonight, because obviously that's a little bit of a big topic.
Could you, you mentioned it quickly, but just to pause it a little bit. Predicamental is a technical term. Exactly.
Predicamental.
What is that?
Predicamental.
Predicamental.
That's an accident
That's
as
a
opposed.
technical term. Exactly what?
It's the accident which is opposed to substance. It is that, substance is that which exists in itself and separate from anything else, whereas an accident, predicamental accident, is that which qualifies a substance. It does not exist in itself, and it is not separable from a substance. It is a qualification or modification of a substance. And of course, Aristotle lists 9 categories of such accidents.
And what is the difference between predicamental and
Predicable?
predicable?
I was afraid you'd ask me that. I haven't taught this for so long I don't remember. Predicable has to do with the way that the predicate applies to the subject. If I remember correctly, there are 5 of them, because we can define something according to whether it belongs to a genus, a species, proper accident or property, and then you've got the predicamental accident, which is not a proper accident. Proper accident, for example, you have a sense of humor because you're a human being. You can't help it. It belongs to your very nature as a human being. That's a proper accident. But you happen to have dark hair. That doesn't belong to your very nature as a human being. So the color of your hair is a predicamental accident. And that's what evil is. It's a predicamental accident.
So a predicable accident is that I have a sense of humor.
No,
Because
that's
I
a
am
property.
human?
No, that's a property.
That's a property.
That's an example of a predicable accident. Predicable accidents refer to the ways in which a quality may refer to a subject. It's a different animal. The ones that we're dealing with here are predicamental, and those are the ones that normally are opposed to substance. Evil is a predicamental accident. It's not a proper accident. If it was a proper accident, you'd have to be evil. It belonged to your very nature. It flowed from your nature to be evil. We can't say that. Nor can we say that you are evil by reason of your species or your genus, because that would be part of your very essence. So we say it is what was it, fifth one. So we have a proper accident, and then we have the predicable accident, which is something that doesn't belong to a thing by its very nature. That also, I suspect, would therefore be a predicamental accident. I'm very hesitant to say those are coextensive terms, though. But there are 2 different ways of listing accidents, and this one's the predicamental one. The thing you got to remember is that it's accidental because you don't want to say evil. A thing has to be evil. Nothing has to be evil. So it's added to the nature. It's something wrong with the nature, something that isn't there, that's not the way it should be. We got a disease because a disease is the lack of the state of health and well-being in the being. But the disease itself, as in the case of a cold, could be rampaging through you because you got a really healthy virus. So considered from the standpoint of the thing that is causing the disease, it may be doing great. It may be wonderful in its own order. You have to also remember we tend to name things as good or bad, mostly in reference to ourselves. That's why it's so hard to grasp the transcendental good, because you're being asked to see it in terms of objective being, ultimately with God as the highest being, the highest good. Whereas we're used to saying, well, is it good for me? What's in it for me? What's bad about it for me? From the standpoint, and we'll probably deal with this later on, I mean, consider when you're going through the jungle and a lion eats you. Is that good or bad?
It's good for the lion.
It's good for the lion, you know? He's having his lunch. It's not so good for you. Okay, anything else? We'll finish for tonight then. And we'll take up evil next time.
This recording is produced and distributed by Olteen Library Services, all rights reserved. For more, go to www.aquinasphilosophy.com.